Today we're here to talk about Miles Franklin's My Brilliant Career. Today we'll look through some of the key events from the text with evidence and connections to photograph 51. In the beginning, written in Possum Gully in 1899, Sibylla includes a special notice stating it is better to have been born a slave, a black, or a cripple than her life as a creative-minded poet. Sibylla, like Rosalind, is marginalised. Sibylla is excluded for her poetic talents and Rosalind for her advances in the field of science. Like Rosalind, Sibylla prompts others to keep opinions to themselves and to not pass judgment of her, as seen in the quote where Sibylla asks, "What matters to you if I'm egotistical?" Sibylla feels isolated from other people in the same way Rosalind is excluded by the men's at King's College. Yet Sibylla, in this opening scene, seems to be far more removed, more widely from all people, as she says, alone, because this soul is as far above common mortals as common mortals are above monkeys. Sibylla then transitions to her earliest memory, as a 3-year-old crying after burning her hand. It is in this scene we see a comparison between the traits and the way her mother treats her, and also the way her father treats her, even as a young child. Both Rosalind and Sibylla's lives are shaped by their early childhood experiences. Rosalind's father is a more positive role model than Richard Melvin. Although he has his doubts, Rosalind's father still encourages her to be a scientist. Sibylla's father is at the beginning kind and tolerant. We can see this in his quotes. "The rubbishing conventionalities, which are the curse of her sex, will bother her soon enough." It shows that Dick Melvin acknowledges the limits that Sibylla will encounter in her life as a young woman. However, as Dick Melvin's own life begins to descend into failure, so diminishes his relationship and support of Sibylla. We can see that fathers in both texts acknowledge the limits placed on their daughters by their gender. For instance, Rosalind's father telling her if she continued as a scientist, she could never be wrong or would be judged for her mistakes. It is this advice which we can interpret ultimately leads to some of the incidents that cause her untimely death. The next significant event in My Brilliant Career is where Sibylla's father, Dick Melvin, abandons his successful cattle breeding enterprise to go into sheep trading. He relocates the family to Possum Gully. The pursuit of wealth and accolades of Crick and Watson in photograph 51 is similar to the desires of Dick Melvin. While in different fields, he seeks a better life, fortune, and Dick Melvin is spurred by others showering him with praise for his intellect. Risk and ambition is also seen in photograph 51 with Rosalind. We can see some comparison to Dick Melvin, although Rosalind eventually succeeds after leaving a respected position in Paris. Richard risks his current standing and loses it all due to his ambition and risk-taking, showing these attributes could be both positive and negative. Sibylla loathes the stagnancy of life in Possum Gully, and she continues on to say that the biggest event of all was the new advent of new residents. But then she reflects more on what life is like for her mother in Possum Gully, that her mother, Lucy Melvin, essentially receives visitors, callers male and female, and that this bored her gentle mother excessively. Rosalind's initial dissatisfaction at King's College is mirrored in the way that Lucy Melvin rejects life at Possum Gully. While her daughter Sibylla also struggles with the stagnant life on the farm, Lucy is isolated as her husband leaves her alone in a place she did not want to leave to entertain guests. The women in both texts have little control over the major decisions in their lives. While Rosalind chooses to work at King's College, she feels dissatisfied after learning Wilkins believes that she is to be his assistant. When he suggests a partnership, she feels no choice but to accept this due to her social standing. When we look at Lucy Melvin, we can see that she has not chosen this life at Possum Gully. And as such, as she unravels as a person and is in a really negative relationship with Sibylla later in the text, we have to look at the way that Dick Melvin's decisions have impacted the women in his life. As we could probably predict, the next significant event in my brilliant career is Richard Melvin's venture into livestock failing. Subsequently, he loses his money and goes into debt and takes to drinking. The failure of Dick Melvin's venture into livestock and the failure of Crick and Watson to find the secret of life after they are told to stop work on the project. Both of these showcase the risks involved with ambition and desire. We can set a goal for ourselves, but what happens when we fail? In response to his failure, Dick becomes an alcoholic and retreats from his family, whereas Watson and Crick become more determined to succeed, even if they have to unethically take the work of Rosalind. We could also look at this event and consider determination in the text. Determination is further showcased through Rosalind's desire to take better photographs of DNA. Despite her previous failures to achieve this, she continues on at the risk of endangering herself. We don't see this type of determination from the weak and apathetic Dick Melvin. While on the farm, Sibylla feeds the exhausted and starving cows. She helps her parents to lift them to their feet to be milked. Slowly but surely, these cows and their calves starve to death. Why does Miles Franklin include this? Well, it could be representative of the bigger pictures in the text, perhaps of endurance through hard times. The cows have very few possibilities to reach maturity and to live a life. They are consumed by the greed of man, and they are depicted by Sibylla as slaves. This could be seen as a representation of the way women too are oppressed by their husbands and fathers in this era. Even the cattle are at the mercy of the irresponsible men like Dick Melvin, who have led to their demise. During this time, Sibylla talks about her passions, and it is these passions that seemingly take her away from moments of hardship. Rosalind, like Sibylla, is fueled by passion. Rosalind for science and Sibylla the arts. Even in the most challenging hardships, the women refer to these as the source of their inspiration and motivation. As a consequence of the poor decisions that the father has made, the Melvin property is seized and their possessions are auctioned. Sibylla recalls this moment in her life. She talks about the expectations placed upon her as a woman as her family starts to unravel. Essentially, she's being expected to be able to cook, to sew, to clean. These are conventional traits, and there are very few options which she is allowed or expected to do beyond these roles. Similarly, Rosalind is discriminated for being a woman in science. However, she has succeeded in doing so. She challenges the expectations of gender roles in the 1950s and post-World War II. We don't see this type of challenge from Sibylla as yet. Sibylla is still quite a young girl at this stage in the text. But she considers the way that she's treated. She is told she is a very useless girl, the perfect she-devil, and as such she strongly believes no one wants or cares for me, as her life begins to unravel. Poverty is a recurrent problem for Sibylla's family. However, financial difficulty is seldom mentioned in photograph 51, except where Watson and Crick refer to the financial gain of discovering the secret of life. Sibylla, as we mentioned, is passionate about the arts. At age just 13, she secretly submits a manuscript that she has written to a Sydney publisher. Although they thought she showed great ability, she was lacking any experience. She begins writing again at night and becomes weary and forgetful during the day. As such, her worried mother Lucy writes to her grandmother to seek some advice. Sibylla's book was rejected. She was told to study literature further. However, due to poverty and her gender, she was unable to pursue her ambition. From what Sibylla has said, it's clear that she would have really loved to do this. Ambition as boundless as the mighty bush. And she knows that she cannot get the education she needs, the schooling, the time to devote to writing and studying literature, because she's required by her family to do other chores. She acknowledges that only men who could take the world by its ears, and that she, as a young woman, is forced to sit with tied hands and patiently suffer. She reflects that provided a woman is beautiful, allowances will be made for all of her shortcomings. It's unfortunate at this stage that Sibylla has to put her ambition aside. When we look at Rosalind in photograph 51, she possesses a similar ambition for science and for being right. She is hindered by her gender, but she is able to succeed at being a reputable scientist, as she has a doctorate. We can look at these two women side by side. We can look at the ways that they have struggled to overcome the different hurdles in their lives. Access to education, access to resources to pursue their desires, opportunities being offered to men when they're not offered to women, are just some of the things that we can look at in these texts. Sibylla then has a tearful confession about her hideousness, and she believes that this will prevent anyone from ever loving her. She has now moved up to Kattegat with her grandmother and her Aunt Helen. It is Aunt Helen's goal to transform Sibylla into a nice-looking girl. In the society of both texts, women are expected to strain their spirits, as a wild, spirited young woman had no place in the world designed for men. When we look at some of the early discussion around Sibylla arriving at Kattegat, she is described as wild and wayward. She is told she must curb and strain her spirit, bring it into subjection. Wow. It's really challenging to see that her spirit is literally being crushed here. Instead, she is told that she would make a nice-looking little girl, and that is what Aunt Helen can make of you. There is this type of contrast that we can also look at between Helen Bossier and Rosalind Franklin. As we're introduced to Aunt Helen in this section as well, we learn more about her life. It is clear that both of these women have been betrayed by men that they have trusted. Aunt Helen is very beautiful. She's done everything right as we can look at it through the era. Helen, as her husband has rejected her, despite her beautiful exterior, and she is then relegated back to the family home. Whereas we can look at Rosalind, whose betrayal comes from colleagues and those in her professional sphere. We can then look at Frank Haughton. Frank Haughton follows Sibylla about just expressing his unwelcome interest in her. At this stage, her grandmother, Mrs. Bossier, warns Sibylla about the crime of encouraging young men. Uncle Julius then returns to Kattegat along with Everard Grey, who is Granny's adopted son. When finally permitted to look in the mirror, Sibylla regards herself with pleasured surprise. She spends the evening entertaining the people at the home in Kattegat. Here are a couple of quotes that we can look at. While entertaining, it's clear that everyone in the room is captivated by Sibylla's talents. She comments, "It mattered not. that I was not pretty, and that on that night I did not look out of the way ugly. So once she's seen herself, she's reflected that perhaps she is a bit more beautiful than what she realizes. Sibylla, like Rosalind, is impacted by what the male characters in her text say about her and her work. Everyone is surprised that Sibylla is quite a talented entertainer. She never saw herself excelling in this area. She is then upheld, and she really believes that she could pursue this type of artwork. Then we see Rosalind. Rosalind knows that she is capable, while Sibylla has never known these talents. Men are both surprised by Sibylla and by Rosalind's capabilities in each text. Sibylla then recounts Everard Grey and Uncle Julius trying to convince Granny that Sibylla should go on the stage. Granny angrily rejects this idea. Later, Sibylla overhears Aunt Helen and Everard Grey discussing taking her to Sydney. It is suggested that Everard Grey will marry her to avoid a scandal. Both Sibylla and Rosalind reject the idea that men are able to accept and decline any opportunities they wish, while women in both texts are repressed and limited by the men in their lives. But not only the men in My Brilliant Career are limiting. Sibylla cannot choose to pursue a life on the stage and is restricted by the hierarchical nature of the family. And that as a young girl, she must have her grandmother's approval, but also that she must marry Grey, and that is the only way to make this dream appropriate if she approves. In a different way, Rosalind is confined by those around her. Wilkins relegates her from the lead scientist to his partner. She's excluded from the common room, and by extension, the academic discussion that occurs in this space. It makes all of Rosalind's opportunities less, and Rosalind has little power to change it. Not getting the message, Frank Hawden continues to court Sibylla and declares that he intends to marry her. She laughs at him, and in this moment, he seizes her wrist. In response, she hits him in the nose. He then complains to Mrs. Bossier, and it is Sibylla who is reprimanded, not Frank. Likewise to the experience of Rosalind and Wilkins, Frank and Sibylla start off on the wrong foot. Like Rosalind, Sibylla is affected by her place in society as a woman, as the men around her dominate and hold power over her. In this case, Frank treats Sibylla like an object, and Wilkins, Rosalind, like a lowly assistant. Both Rosalind and Sibylla are strong female characters who unapologetically express their opinions. In a comparable way to Rosalind, Sibylla is trapped as a woman who is aware of gender inequality, and she knows that she faces this on a daily basis. There is an unfair advantage that men have in being able to make mistakes, but still being ideal in society. We can see that Frank is the one that grabs at Sibylla, yet there is no reprimanding of Frank here. Frank Hawden compares to the men in photograph 51, as he believes that he holds power over Sibylla as she is lesser than him. We can look at Wilkins and we can look at Watson, who have little regard for Rosalind's work or autonomy. Frank has decided he will marry Sibylla, and upon rejection, he is unhappy. Upon being hit, he is unhappy. Yet Sibylla is the one who is in trouble. We're then introduced to Harold Beecham, Sibylla's only real sweetheart. Similar to Rosalind, Sibylla only has one real sweetheart, who she does not end up with, due to placing her career first. Despite obvious affections and invitations from the young American scientist Don Caspar, Rosalind rejects the idea of romance until her work and her thinking is near completion. Like Rosalind, Sibylla stands up for herself in front of Harold Beecham. She goes against the norms of the time. Both women show rebellion and courage when it comes to love and life. We see Rosalind throwing Watson out of her laboratory for being condescending. Neither women are prepared to tolerate less than what they believe they deserve. And as we are introduced to this new story where Sibylla goes on this journey with Harold Beecham, we can unpack more similarities in the way that Rosalind and Sibylla reject social norms. Early in their relationship, Sibylla and Harold go rowing. Sibylla is dangling her feet over the side. During this time, the boat capsizes and Harold manages to get them both to shore. Sibylla is rescued from the capsized boat by Harold Beecham, representing conventional gender roles in the text. Sibylla, unable to swim, is the helpless damsel in distress, while the masculine Beecham effortlessly saves her from drowning. Upon saving her, Harold calls Sibylla queer. When her response is one of jovial comedy, she is neither thankful nor distressed, signalling she is unlike other women of the times. Due to her age, Sibylla may be seen as more vulnerable than the grown Rosalind Franklin. Rosalind continually reiterates she prefers to work in isolation. She doesn't need assistance in interpreting her data. In this way, the male hero is diminished in photograph 51, as Sibylla rejects her hero, Harold Beecham. Sibylla then devises a plan to visit Harold. Her grandmother approves, saying that Frank must accompany Sibylla. Wildly, Sibylla agrees, but then drives off without Frank when he opens the gate. She meets up with Harold alone, and then he insists on escorting her back to Kattegat. Upon returning to Kattegat, Frank is very upset, and he calls Sibylla a spoilt and petted tomboy. Sibylla breaks free of her chaperone Frank in an attempt to meet up with Harry Beecham alone. Well, this type of encounter between unmarried people, coupled with Sibylla taking control of the horses on full tilt, shows Sibylla defying social constraints despite the later consequences. It continues as Harry attempts to escort Sibylla back. She continually rejects his chivalry, but then comments that she would have despised him if he had given in to her. This shows to an extent Sibylla is dishonest about her intentions when she speaks to Harold. It could foreshadow the later way that she accepts and then rejects his proposal. Rosalind, on the other hand, is more forthright and mature. She speaks clearly and precisely due to her academic nature, but likely also linked to her father's warning about being disrespected in her field. Rosalind, in an icy tone, makes clear her disdain for Wilkins' proposal to be partners and ensures that there is no misunderstanding about her wants and desires. By using these two scenes, we can contrast the way Sibylla and Rosalind use language to convey their wants, desires, and expectations from the relationships in their lives. Similar to the warning that Sibylla received earlier from Granny, Aunt Helen questions Sibylla about whether she intends to marry Harold Beecham. She believes that from all these interactions, Harold actually loves Sibylla and advises her that she should never play with a man's heart. Sibylla is warned by her aunt not to play with Harold Beecham's affections, showing that there was a double standard for the way men and women courted. This can also be seen in photograph 51 in Wilkins' awkward courting of Margaret Ramsay, who he doesn't take on a date or woo, but boldly confesses his love, which was followed by a rejection from the Cambridge scientist. Like Harold, Wilkins is rejected, but Harold has pursued a long-term interest in courting Sibylla, adhering to what he believes is the right way to find a wife. Both men end up without their loves. The next significant event in my brilliant career looks at the engagement where Harold proposes to Sibylla, who, much to her own surprise, I don't think the surprise of the audience, accepts this proposal. When he tries to kiss her, she then strikes him on the face with his riding whip. She's horrified at what she's done. However, Harold is gentle and forgiving. While Sibylla has decided to accept Harold's proposal and starts to build a connection with the man whom she believes she could build a life with, she ultimately does not accept the institution of marriage. It contradicts her own professional goals. In the same manner, in photograph 51, Rosalind connects with Don Caspar. Their feelings, however, do not seem to deepen due to her hyper-focus, professionalism, but also Caspar's respect for her as a doctor above all else. Harold's calm and gentle reaction after Sibylla whips him across the face shows the difference between the way some men act towards women and the relationship between men and women in My Brilliant Career compared to photograph 51. Rosalind already finds it very difficult in a male-dominated society, but she has to deal with the disloyalty, but also the non-physical harms of being disrespected, having her work stolen and plagiarized. She's harassed by Watson in her own laboratory, who comes to gossip and snoop, yet when she verbally rejects him from her own lab, Watson calls her a hag. So if we look here at these two interactions, one where Harold is hit and one where Watson is kicked out of the lab, we can look at the different way that the men respond to the confident women in their lives. In a twist, Harold loses all of his money and the ownership of his properties. He attempts to release Sibylla from their engagement, but she declares that she has no interest in money and promises to marry him when she's 21, even if he is poor. Harold continues to tell Sibylla he cannot allow her to sacrifice herself to a poor man, but she believes her experience with poverty and hard work will enable them to help each other. As such, they agree to a secret engagement of 4 years. Sibylla displays difference from other women at the time. She's insulted when Harold suggests that he is not worthy because he has lost his wealth. Sibylla feels ashamed when she does not want to be Harold's wife because this is not in line with the societal beliefs at the time. Yet she keeps this to herself and continually reiterates that she will be marrying Harold. In a surprising turn of events, she is agreeable to a secret engagement, but continues to comment saying things like it was a sacrifice and she was a selfish coward for accepting. We can contrast this against the women in photograph 51, who are more certain about their acceptance and rejection of future partners. The women in photograph 51 are older. They also come 50 years in the future, indicating growing confidence and freedoms. Some of the key events that we may wish to look at photograph 51 around acceptance and rejection of relationships. We can look at Margaret Ramsay's rejection of Wilkins, Rosalind's rejection of Wilkins' chocolates, but also Odile Crick moving out of the matrimonial bed. As the book begins to conclude, there is another crisis. Sibylla's mother writes that she must leave Kattegat to help pay for her father's debts, and she will be now working as a governess for the slovenly, ill-mannered Emswats. Both Sibylla and her grandmother try to write back to Lucy, hoping to change her mind, but to no avail. Sibylla is powerless to defy the instructions of her mother. She must work to pay off her alcoholic father's debts, again showing little power and autonomy in her life. Sibylla and her grandmother plead for the decision to be changed, but Sibylla is sent regardless due to the cruelties of her mother, but also the dire financial situation. We could look at this as an example of Sibylla's wasted talents. In the same way, Rosalind acknowledges upon arrival at King's College that complaining about her situation would do little to change the circumstances. She voices this to Wilkins about the proposed partnership and continues, yet there are instances where she does vent to Gosling about the archaic nature of the situation. One of the significant events that happens while Sibylla is working at the Emswats is where she is called in to speak to Mr. Emswatt because she is seen meeting with Peter, his eldest son. In fact, Sibylla was out looking at the stars and enjoying the night air, and this is misinterpreted by the father thinking that she is in love with Peter, and she has to angrily reject this suggestion. We can look at Mr. Emswatt as a representation of the narrow-minded view of the time, that women were constantly searching for a husband and had no other purpose than to create children. Mr. Emswatt, of course, mistakes Sibylla's private conversation with Peter as about courtship. Where could we look at this fitting in with photograph 51? There are instances where things are misconstrued. We could look at the fact that Gosling immediately asks about a Mr. Franklin when Rosalind arrives. We can look at the way that Wilkins brings chocolates in, believing that will fix the relationship with Rosalind, and that these male to female relationships are more complex. Yet there are people like Mr. Emswatt who think that it's very simplistic. Ending her time with the Emswatts, Sibylla becomes ill, and the kind-handed family think that they have overworked her. As such, they write to Sibylla's parents, who agree that Sibylla can return home to Possum Gully. In an attempt to remove herself from the unpleasant situation at Barney's Gap, Sibylla retreats to her room unwell. The illness is wrongly assumed by the Emswatts to be from being overworked, and they organise a passage home to Possum Gully. As a result of her unrelated illness, she is sent home and achieves her objective of getting away from this perverse situation. Rosalind in photograph 51 also experiences illness, but a fatal one. Due to her work with X-rays, she is exposed to dangerous radiation and as such develops tumours on her ovaries. Unlike Sibylla's domestic duties, Rosalind's scientific work actually does make her ill, and as such, she is unable to complete her work before she dies. Regardless, Watson and Crick use her work as their own and publish before her. Concluding our text, we do have a couple more key events. Harold, who has regained his fortune, comes to beg Sibylla to marry him and refuses to take no for an answer until the following morning. Sibylla continues to reject Harold, and rather than facing him again, Sibylla writes a letter explaining she intends to never marry and advises him to go and find someone worthy of being his wife. Sibylla rejects the desperate Harold, who only wants to love her and have her as his bride. He claims that he will do anything. For example, he says, "I believe you are the proudest girl in the world. I know you are too clever for me, but I love you." He never actually says to her that she would be free to have a career, though. It's just implied that the plan is to return to their previous experience at 5 Bob Down. Sibylla does not accept this. She rejects Harold and rejects marriage, saying, "Go and marry the sort of woman you ought to marry, the sort that all men like, a good conventional woman who will do the things she should at the proper time." He explains that I will be good to you, you can have what you like. But ultimately, she says, I do not mean to ever marry. And ultimately, she says to him, I have set you free. When looking at photograph 51, although single for most of the text, Rosalind eventually relents to Don Casper's request to go to dinner. She considers internally what she truly desires, and that it was to be kissed. However, for Rosalind, it is all too late, and shortly after this, she succumbs to ovarian cancer, neither woman pursuing a long-term fulfilling relationship, but fulfilling careers.